Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's book is the suggestion of patron Shay Kun, who wanted me to take a look at a Japanese light novel series called Ascendance of a Bookworm. The series is up to 26 books and counting, but I decided it was enough to begin with Book 1, first published in Japan in 2015, and then translated to English in 2019. About the author. Light novels are one of the three big pillars of Japanese young adult media, with the other two being manga and anime. I have no doubt that my audience is at least familiar with the second two forms, or at least you're aware of them, but I figure light novels deserve a bit of an introduction. So the first thing is that light novels are exactly what they sound like. They are full novels in terms of length, but they tend to be on the short side and use relatively simplistic prose so that a reader can potentially get through a whole book during a quiet afternoon. The books also tend to come out in long-running series and favor speculative fiction genres like science fiction and fantasy. The last thing is that they feature a few manga-style illustrations, maybe around 5 or 6 per book. Now it's worth noting that, aside from the illustrations, none of this is unique to Japanese young adult literature. The English YA market is full of that sort of series, like Artemis Fowl by Owen Colfer, the Old Xanth series by Piers Anthony, and the even older mystery standbys like The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. The biggest differences come from the fact that light novels generally have no endpoint in mind, and so a single series can have dozens of titles in it. And it tends to have an episodic format that makes it easy to adapt into manga and anime series. Since Japanese book and comic publishers tend to be the same companies, adaptability is a feature they look for. Today's author is an example of how the internet has entered this publishing chain. Her name is Mia Kazuki, and the first place she published Ascendance of a Bookworm was on a website called Shosetsuka ni Naro, which translates to, "Let's become a novelist." It's a place where anybody can upload and read stories for free. So, kind of like fanfiction.net, but also for completely original works. More than a few of the novels posted on this site were later picked up for official publication, although it's a vanishingly small percentage of the total number of novels they host. Other series originally published on Naro include Log Horizon, That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, Overlord, and ReZero. In this case, Ascendance of a Bookworm was picked up by T.O. Books, which started publishing the original text in light novel format and as a manga adaptation in 2015. They then gave the anime adaptation to Achiado Animation Works, and the anime has so far run for 2 seasons and covered the first 2 story arcs. They're also working on a 3rd season, which hasn't yet come out. One last thing I'd like to mention before I begin the review is that Ascendance of a Bookworm is part of a subgenre called isekai. The premise of an isekai story is that the protagonist is from the modern world, but somehow gets transported into a fantasy realm. Much like light novels, the isekai premise wasn't invented by Japanese authors, but it's become so popular among them in recent years that it's become its own genre. Now, of course, there is some argument over what the precise qualifications of an isekai story is, but that's all just nonsense. Like I always say, the only purpose of a genre is to help people find new stories that they might like. Everything else is just pointless gatekeeping. But that's enough about that. The review. Urano Motosu is a Japanese woman in her last year of college, and her true love is books. She plans on becoming a librarian once she graduates, but then an earthquake causes a shelf full of books to topple over and kill her. She then finds herself in the body of a dying 5-year-old girl named Mine in a world based on medieval Europe, but with a few minor fantasy elements sprinkled in. Her father is a guard captain who oversees a city gate, her mother is a seamstress, and her older sister plans on becoming an apprentice cloth dyer once she turns 7. Because this is a time and place that predates cheap paper and the printing press, books are so expensive that only nobles and the clergy can afford them. This drives Mine up the walls, since books are the only thing in life she lives for. But once she settles down, she decides that if she can't find books, she'll just have to make them. She first tries to weave a papyrus scroll, but the plant fibers she finds are too fine to weave. She then tries to bake clay tablets, but the tablets explode when she puts them in her family's furnace. Last, she tries to carve wooden sticks called moken, but her illiterate mother confuses them for firewood and burns them up. She almost gives up on life after that last failure, but after meeting with a merchant, she gets inspired to ask a boy named Lutz to help her create some actual paper. Meanwhile, Mine also learns how life in a medieval city works, and uses her knowledge of Japan to invent things like shampoo, lacework, and pancakes. One thing I like about the book is that it highlights a lot of points that most isekai stories tend to gloss over. Oftentimes, the person who dies in Japan and gets reincarnated in a new world is reincarnated as a full adult, with no explanation given as to where the body came from or what happened to the mind of the person who had it before. In this case, it's clear from the start. The original mind dies of a fever at the age of 5, and Urano only takes over after she passes on. It's not often that a book from any nation begins with the death of a little girl. Something else the book does is make a very big deal about the difficulties of living in a European town during the Middle Ages. Traveling merchants are looked down upon as a necessary evil. Children have to start working at the age of 7. Poor folk have to spend their winters huddled around a fire most of the day, and a lot of families regularly go hungry because they have more children than they can afford to feed. Child disease is also a major problem. Mine herself has a condition called the Devouring, which is where the mana in her body overflows and overheats her body. This mana would allow her to cast spells, but she needs expensive magic tools to do so, tools that only wealthy nobles can afford. However, while I generally appreciate this attention to detail, much like the Devouring, the details of this book tend to overflow and consume the actual story. One other aspect of light novels I haven't mentioned yet is that their authors tend to use them as vehicles to gush about their hobbies and interests. Log Horizon is a mental exercise on how to construct a society if it was based on the rules of an MMORPG instead of real-world physics. Spice and Wolf focuses on the vagaries of the medieval trade economy. Campione is an action series that's secretly about the historical origins of divine myths. In Ascension of a Bookworm's case, the focus is on the daily life of people living in the European Middle Ages, and I suspect the titular Ascension is an excuse for the author to detail the various strata of society one by one. Speaking in general, I love reading about history. Finding out how people lived in different times and places, and learning about all kinds of random facts and details. But when I read a story, I prefer it when that story focuses less on the details and more on the characters and the main plot. So while I liked all of the characters in Bookworm, and I consider them to be well-rounded and interesting, and while I enjoyed the level of detail Kazuki put into the world she made, I couldn't help but wish that some of those details would have been set aside, or else spaced out between scenes that did more to move the plot forward. Now, as I pointed out, this isn't a unique problem as far as light novels go, but then, for me, this isn't a unique complaint either. Still, Ascendance of a Bookworm isn't a bad novel series, not by any means. And if you have more patience for a slow-paced story than I do, then you might just love this series. I only wish I could. The analysis. The one overwhelming theme of this first novel is persistence. Mine is stuck in a body that has weakened from years of chronic fevers, and when the book begins, she gets exhausted just from walking from her apartment down to the ground floor. However, after months of exercise and practice, she manages to get to the town gate without needing help, and she eventually manages to walk to the woods with all of the other kids and help pick up firewood. Similarly, when she finds out that her family is too poor to afford a book, she decides to make one of her own. And she fails, over and over again. It gets to the point where she almost gives up and dies, but then a promise she made to Lutz brings her back. And after that, she realizes that if she can't make a book on her own, maybe she could do it if she had some help. And so that's exactly what she sets out to do. Aside from that, I suppose another theme of the book is that you should try to understand a foreign culture before you judge it. There's a lot about her new world that mine doesn't understand, but there are always solid reasons behind everything her family does. They let dirt and mud build up on their apartment floor, but that's because they wear their shoes everywhere and don't have to worry about getting their feet dirty. Women like mine's mother are extremely focused on sewing and embroidery, but then that's because it's the only way they can show their beauty, since they don't have access to makeup or hair care products. Then, on the other hand, when mine uses her knowledge of modern Japan to improve her family's lives, they're always skeptical at first, but they eventually see just how much better things can be when they follow her lead. Don't think there's much more to it than that, though. Like I said in the last section, the book is heavy on details, but light on plot. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.